So in learning about U.S. colored troops from Murray County and Williamson County, we've heard about Fort Negley quite a few times. And so I thought the only thing to do is to head up to Fort Negley and talk to my friend Krista and learn more about what people experienced there. So Krista, I have heard a lot about Fort Negley, and I'm curious to know from you, what is Fort Negley?
So Fort Negley is the largest inland masonry fortification built during the Civil War. It was one of 5 major fortifications in Nashville. There were also about 21 minor installations and about 20 miles of earthworks. And sadly, of all those earthworks and fortifications, Fort Negley is the only one that remains. There's maybe about a mile and a half of those entrenchments left in Nashville. So that huge fortified system actually made Nashville the most heavily fortified city in the U.S., with the exception of Washington, D.C.
Wow. That surprises me.
Yeah.
So was Nashville a really important place in the Civil War then for them to fortify it so heavily?
Yeah, Nashville was very unique to the South. It was very developed. It had roadways, railways, of course the Cumberland River, but there was also a very large merchant, banking, and manufacturing center already here. So as far as the both armies, Union and Confederate, were concerned, there were numerous modes of transportation, but then also large buildings that could be used for storing goods and soldiers.
Gotcha. So you talk about Fort Negley, it's all of these earthworks, miles of earthworks, right? Who's constructing that? That seems like a lot of work.
It is. So the story really begins in August 1862, and throughout that spring and summer, the Federal Army was plagued by Confederates and irregulars outside of Nashville, really harassing and threatening to retake the city. So they decided to do what they did in those days, which was build a ring of fortifications that could be manned with, 5,000 or 6,000 troops, because they really wanted troops on the front lines. So the original intention was to use federal troops to build the fortifications. When there weren't enough troops to do that, they started looking at other available populations. So from the time federal troops came to Nashville in February, enslaved people throughout the region quickly understood that federal troops had basically planted free soil in the slave South. Mm-hmm. And escaping to freedom suddenly became a lot easier. Not easy by any means, but a lot easier. They no longer had to make it past the Ohio River.
So closer.
Closer, yes, definitely closer. So what you find is a trickle of self-emancipated people quickly becomes a flood. Mm-hmm. And they're coming to anywhere where there's large troop encampments for protection. So by August, the Army starts first looking at slaves that are still in bondage owned by Confederate sympathizers. So they requisition those slaves. Then they look toward slaves owned by Union sympathizers. And then after that, they start forcibly impressing people into service. Really, all of this impressing of people begins with General Butler at Fort Monroe in Virginia. So in 1861, a couple of slaves who are impressed at a Confederate fort across the river come to Fort Monroe. When an agent of their owner comes to retrieve them, Butler basically says, you know that whole thing about people being property? Well, you're using this property to build forts to make war against the United States. By the laws of war, we can take this property. So they were basically taking the South's ideology and turning it on its head. So like in Nashville, in Virginia, once word spread, and it spread very quickly, people began self-emancipating in huge numbers. And from what we know, they weren't ill-informed. They knew that there was disease. They knew there wasn't adequate shelter, there wasn't adequate food, medical treatment, but they made those very calculated decisions to seek freedom. And I think the way most of us were taught is that slaves kind of sat around waiting for someone to hand them freedom, and that's just absolutely not the case. We don't know a lot about how many people were here. We just have the labor rolls, which show a little more than 2,700. But there certainly would have been people here that weren't on those rolls. There would have been about 1,000 soldiers in Fort Negley. And the soldiers were set up on a rotation, so they would rotate in and out of the fort, with the exception of the artillerymen. They would stay. Living at Fort Negley was not a pleasant experience, especially in the laborers' camp. If they were given tents by the Army, they were the battered, torn tents that were no longer usable by soldiers. They would have been given, if they were given rations, they would have been given the leftover rations. There was an intent to pay laborers, and we do have on those laborer rolls records of people being paid, but the majority of those who worked at Fort Negley weren't paid.
So that leads me to my next question is, at what point do these laborers, the men at least, at what point do they transition from laborers to actually members of the U.S. colored troops? So
that would start in about July and August, 1863.
Okay, so construction starts here
in August 62.
Okay, so it's not until a year later. All right.
Right. And so once you have these enlistments, and the Army sent out agents all over Nashville into the countryside to recruit USCTs. So of course that sets up another deficit in labor. So you see it in the newspapers right after USCT start enlisting, you start seeing more intensified raids into Nashville by white soldiers looking for African Americans to bring to the fortification.
So once someone's in the USCT, then what does that change about their experience? Anything?
Well,
they get paid.
They get paid. They get a set of brand new clothes. So they get that Union blue uniform. Probably the first set of new clothes they've ever owned. They get a new pair of boots. They get a weapon. And there are, again, newspaper articles where white civilians are very upset that their former slaves are suddenly walking around town with confidence, wearing these blue uniforms. So it gave a lot of former slaves a sense of self. They also got rations. So, they were you know, they weren't treated as well as white soldiers, of course, but they were. It was certainly better treatment than when they were slaves and impressed laborers.
Right. So what happens to then all of the laborers? Because of course you've got the laborers, you've got USCT members, you've got family. You know, what happens to all these people after the war?
So after the war, the labor camp grew into a little suburb called Rocktown. And it basically stretched from the base of Fort Negley across Franklin Pike, where it kind of met the labor camp at Fort Morton, just right up the road on Edge Hill. And the camp at Fort Morton became New Bethel. So you had these two little suburbs of New Bethel and Rocktown that disappear from the newspapers between the 1890s and the turn of the last century. But the newspapers either describe, you know, cozy little communities of about 200 buildings and homes, or, you know, the depths of despair and evil. So, you know, it seems if there was a crime committed in Nashville, in this, you know, South Nashville area, the first place they would look is Rocktown or New Bethel. They were immediately after the war, well, up until about 1868, the Klan actually used the fort as a meeting place, and Rocktown appealed to the city for help. They wanted police support. When they didn't get it, a man named Leander Wood, who was a former laborer here, a USCT resident of Rocktown, created his own guard of about 50 men. They purchased weapons, they purchased gunpowder, and the outrage amongst white citizens in the paper toward Leander Wood far eclipses any kind of outrage that they might have had for the people harassing them. So eventually, the Klan was disbanded in Tennessee and driven out of Fort Negley. But really, you know, the conflicts continued up until the middle of the 20th century, because Rocktown continued to grow into a neighborhood. It was incorporated into the city. And in the early 1950s, there was a rash of cross burnings across Nashville. And several of those crosses were at the very top of Fort Negley.
Now, Fort Negley has recently been designated as a site of remembrance, or?
It is, yes, it's part of UNESCO's Slave Route Project. So UNESCO has, it's not a World Heritage Site, but it has been designated as a site that is integral to our understanding of the global slave trade. And Fort Negley was recognized specifically for self-emancipation. And this spring, Fort Negley was also added to the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, clearly, Fort Negley is a site that has many stories for us to learn, so we'll probably have to come back. But wow, such important information. Really, really integral to our understanding of the history of Middle Tennessee, the history of African Americans in Middle Tennessee. But wow, this has been incredible. I have learned so much about the U.S. colored troops, their involvement in the Civil War, and what an important program that was, or project it was, to get people from slavery into freedom. So wow, thank you so much for
Oh,
sitting
you're
down with us.
welcome.
This has been really great. Thank you.
You're really very welcome.
I had a great time up at Fort Negley talking with my friend Krista Castillo. Clearly, Fort Negley is such an important site, not only in Nashville's history, but in Middle Tennessee and in United States history as well. So I hope that you'll check out their website for more information about how you can safely visit Fort Negley and learn more about it. I did want to say a big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. If you're interested in supporting this project so that we can continue to make this show, I hope that you will visit our Patreon page and consider becoming a member. You can even find out how you can get this awesome mug. So remember, with the new format, we'll be putting out a show for the public on the 15th of every month, and then at the end of the month, our Patreon supporters will have exclusive access to extended interviews. So if you want to dig in deeper, if you want to hear more of these incredible stories, be sure to check out our Patreon page and become a member.